There we go. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. So welcome back to the On Violence Experimental Study Sequence. We welcome Professor Cristina Visperas today, whose book we read this week, Skin Theory. I'm going to ask our three co-facilitators that took on the leadership role this week in the discussion that preceded this part of our meeting to just quickly introduce themselves. And then maybe what I propose is I'll start with a kind of question that invites Cristina to just talk about how she enters the project of this work, this book in particular. And then I think I'd love to just open it up after that to the questions led by the three co-facilitators, and then maybe open that up into the latter part of our previous conversation that was enriched by Leslie's initial set of questions, and then Nassim's elaboration, and then I'll probably chime in as well. I think that would be a good initial sequence, and then we'll go from there. And then, folks, of course, anybody in the room here that has any thoughts or questions that they'd like to share, please, I just ask that you raise your Zoom hand if possible. If not, just put something in chat that asks me to call on you, because I just do my best to keep up with everything while I'm also trying to be engaged with what's going on. So can I ask Alina, then Tony, and then Corinne to introduce yourselves real quick, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, hello, I'm Alina. I am a master's student at UCR in the art history department, and my work is on contemporary art and the use of blood and meat in contemporary art, or blood and flesh, however you want to call it. So this book was very much interesting to me in my studies. So yeah.
Go ahead, Tony.
Hello, and thanks for having me again. Tony Hardy, go by he, him pronouns. I've got interested in this work because of many years working in the emergency medical services field here in San Diego, California. So I've also was incarcerated as a child or as a youth detention centers. So I took interest into this, and I also like to see. I saw that you were connected to UCSD through in the book here, and I saw like a few other people I knew, like Dennis Child. So I reached out to him too. So, oh, more work. But thank you. It's going to be great. Getting to discuss your work. It's phenomenal work, and a whole lot of information that I had no idea. But thank you.
Go ahead, Corinne.
Hey, my name's Corinne. My work deals with Asian American racialization and gendering, how it relates to creating a limited understanding of what it means to be human. And so I was really, interested, and, I really enjoyed the book, but I was really interested in the relationships between like visibility, invisibility, representation, and how it relates to these larger ideas about skin theory. So yeah, really excited to be part of this conversation.
I'll start with the opening question, then maybe I'll go in reverse order of the way the co-facilitators introduce yourself. So I'll go with the key questions that were raised by Corinne, then Tony, then Alina, and then I'll go into that thing with Leslie, Nassim, and me. That was, I think, really important. And I think, Cristina, you can solve all our problems and all of our questions, answer all our questions, and like we'll leave here having been enriched. So okay, so my opening question was really just to get you to talk about the significance as well as the particular kinds of both expected and unanticipated insight and methodological creativity that come from your longer scholarly background, as somebody involved heavily in like the actual practice of laboratory science, who then moves into the radical critical inter-trans anti-disciplinary humanity. So I think that movement, like that scholarly, intellectual, political movement, is really critical to understanding what the condition is, or what kind of like the foundation is for a project like this book. So could you talk about that in whatever way you feel is best for a group of folks that are just kind of dwelling in your book?
Sure thing. So I'll start with that. Yes, my training for almost a decade was in molecular and cellular biology. And I really thought at that time that I would stay in the sciences for the rest of my life because I loved it and I still do. I miss it every day. Given the state of academia, sometimes maybe I think I should have sold my soul to the devil and worked for a pharmaceutical company if I wanted work-life balance. Um, but I, while I was working on neural stem cells in San Diego, I guess I got a little bit bored. I became an adult. It was my first job, and I thought, oh, is this it? I'm just going to clock in 9 to 5. I was really, really bored. And my sister, who was trained in history at UC Irvine, gave me some of her books to, help me kind of expand my ideas, perception of the world. And one of the things I learned through these readings is how frequently in the history of science and medicine, especially in the United States, that marginalized groups are used for knowledge production. And this was repetitive. Since the founding of the country to now, there's something about captive populations, especially, that was my focus, that drew researchers in. And this, at the time, I was so struck by it because I was still under the impression that the sciences were purely objective. There were no politics here. And so to see this repetition of violation, of human violation in the sciences, just struck me as, at least for scientists, completely neurotic. Like, why can't they learn from their mistakes? They are the objective ones, right? They're the ones who pursue knowledge and are never satisfied with what they find. So why aren't they? I had an image of science as very self-correcting and progressive, and that's not what was happening here. And so I realized that these kinds of questions couldn't be answered in doing lab work anymore. And so my thinking had to shift. And so I was looking at the social sciences, and I was looking at the humanities. And with all due respect to the social sciences, I just jumped straight over them and went straight to humanities because I just felt like there's something about the social sciences that was still scientific. Like again, some of my best friends are social scientists, but it was like they tried too much to be like the scientists, and I just realized my thinking wasn't going to shift very much in the social sciences. I'm in a social science department right now. I'm in communication. This was all a professional decision. I wanted to do humanities work with social science funding, though, because that's where all the money goes, the social sciences and the sciences. And when I read Fanon, and Fanon grounds so much of my thinking still, especially in Black Skin, White Mask, there's that off-sided line where he starts talking about microscopes and looking at things under a microscope. And often, that is what it's read at. Oh, Fanon is using microscopy here, but I've done a lot of lab work, and I realized, I'm like, actually, he's not talking about microscopy here. He's talking about a completely different method that precedes microscopy. And so I was trying to find literature about that. There's a lot of interpretations and deployments of Fanon's work. And what we know about Fanon was that he was trained as a clinician. He went to medical school, so he would know the difference between microscopy and procedures that would lead up to that. And so that's when the project came together. I was wondering what it is that made the sciences so neurotic, which I don't think, it's a question I can't pose anywhere else except in the humanities. And of course, Fanon, and many rereadings of Fanon has helped me engage with the humanities. So pretty much all my readings of humanities work tends to be through Fanon, simply because here was someone who was trained in some of the things I was trained at, and is doing very theoretical work at the same time, or was doing theoretical work at the same time.
Could we stick with this for just a minute? I'm going to usurp everyone else for a second. I'm going to exert my teacherly privileges. Could we stick with this? And could you talk for a minute about how your entrance by way of Fanon's working with microscopy or not working with microscopy, and then at the same time Fanon's notion of epidermalization leading you toward the skin? Like, could you talk about that connection real quick? And then I promise I'm going to throw it over to first. Who did I say? It was going to be Corinne first, right? Corinne. Okay. After that, Corinne, you're up. I promise.
I think that was another thing that confused me when I was first reading Fanon and doing this work as a grad student, was his use of epidermalization. And sometimes it is interpreted as internalization of the white gaze, or internalization of of stereotypes about Black people. And I thought to myself, you know, if he meant internalization, he would have said internalization. And again, this is kind of my scientific training. Again, scientists, when we write, we tend not to use prosaic language. That's not something that we're allowed to do. We write very plainly and very specifically. Our articles are very short. We don't make long form argument. We don't make arguments, period, right? So our language and the words that we choose are very careful. And so when Fanon used epidermalization, and as I got to know more about his influences, the psychoanalytic tradition in his work, for example, I realized that something else was happening here, but that by epidermalization, he's taking the materiality of skin to talk about something that we've learned in psychoanalysis, which is that there is nothing deeper than the surface when it comes to our identities, or the self, if we can use that word. And so in terms of race, that was one of the big arguments I make in the book, is that I wanted to trace Blackness across, as a more distributed phenomenon, across skin, across technologies, across practices of visualization, to sort of do the whole, recapitulate other people's arguments about race not being essential, that it is not biological, that it is a kind of doing, but also to return to Fanon's word that this is a kind of masking. Did I say that?
That's great.
Right?
No, thank you. I think that's going to help. That's helping us a lot. I think that's helping us a lot because, yeah, our conversation left off, our class conversation left off thinking through some of what you just addressed in the process of anticipating your presence. So we're going to get back into that in a minute, though. But Corinne, I want to pass the mic over to you because you had some important things to raise around what you sort of were prefacing in your self-introduction.
I was interested, and I think it maybe like relates to this conversation. One of the things I was interested in is the way that you are drawing on spillers, and we were talking about the relationship between in the earlier the relationship between the flesh and the body. The flesh is like vestibular to culture, or to the body, or to political or whatever subjecthood or personhood, and your conversations therein. And I was interested in in the coda, I think throughout, but also in the coda where you're talking about spillers, and I was interested in the ways that maybe in your archives and the work that you were doing, that the conceptual categories, or skin played a role in the conceptual categories, not just of race, but of gender, or how, particularly how they interrelate. And so I'm thinking here of how Spillers' conversation, about the flesh is related to this reading that, she has of Black people and Black women in particular not being able to enter into the symbolic register of mother or woman at the level of the body because of the process of slavery. And also the sort of, you have this conversation, I think it's in chapter 1, that on the tretinoin studies, that, it's a product that is primarily being tested on a population of Black men, but, produces a product that is mostly or like largely marketed to white women. And so I was thinking about that. And then also this conversation about, the way that Spillers has this reading of Moynihan, who makes, Black families sort of these objects of analysis for, social scientific knowledge production, but how that has maybe a parallel or a connection to how Kligman is experimenting, on incarcerated Black people, and in order to produce, these forms of like academic knowledge. And so I just wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more about how you saw these ideas about gender and captivity playing a role, and if there are other places in the archives that you looked at where this came up for you that maybe didn't make it into the discussion in the book, but that help us think about skin theory's relationship to gender.
All right, thank you for that question, and it brought up a lot of things to mind. So to center Spillers' adoption of the term flesh signals her disappointment with the term body. So she was writing at a time when feminist scholarship was really interrogating this body-mind binary and trying to find ways of not really smoothing over the differences between body and mind, but really, interrogating the implications of this binary. And as we saw, Spillers was not satisfied with the theorization of the body. And her theorization of the flesh is related to this notion of ungendering. And oftentimes, what I've also read through this work, it is the ungendering is focused on Black women. So for example, the practice that Spillers talks about is how enslaved women would be punished, or violence would be meted out to them in the same way that it was towards enslaved men. Or she talked about how the very bodies of enslaved women were calculated as commodities in the same way the bodies of enslaved men were calculated. And that was really insightful for me, looking at calculations that were done in the lab. But what I was focused on, because most of the experiments conducted on prisoners at this time were on male populations. I think that was simply by the numbers. Most of the incarcerated population during the time I was looking at were men. But I was trying to show that Black men in the prison I was working on were also ungendered. That this very, even during that time, during the experiments, Kligman knew that tretinoin, which he was formulating at the time, were going to be mainly for white women. He described hyperpigmentation as a cosmetic condition. And so it had all of these gender connotations in it. And so by using the skin of Black men, the Black male test subjects were also ungendered. So I was kind of doing a reversal of Spillers' argument there. But I was also trying to extend it to what bioethics was trying to do, which is to view prisoners as any other kind of vulnerable test subject. So compare prisoners to any other kind of contingently oppressed or subjugated group. And so you can apply particular regulations and laws towards incarcerated test subjects. And I was saying that actually the bioethics, in order for it to do what it did, one, not only did it have to shift its frame of the subject, pretty much not see the prisoner in order to make this assumption that legal statutes can be applied to the prisoner to protect the prisoner, but they also then had to recapitulate the violence of earlier researchers, that they became the very researchers that they condemned and sought to regulate in the first place. And so that's what the concept of flesh, as it was theorized by Spillers, brought to my reading of this space.
So I'm going to break my promise and come back to something that came forward in our discussion as well, which is the relationship, how you would think about the relationship between bioethics as a particular kind of proto-juridical regime or proto-disciplinary regime of the ethical, and ethicality writ large at the site of captive experimentation prison laboratory, and whether there's something that happens in the way you're trying to engage with the problem of bioethics that also indicates the impossibility of the ethical possible. I don't know. I don't know if it's the impossibility. I'm saying that. I'm wondering that if it's indicating the impossibility of the ethical at this particular kind of site, meaning specifically the prison laboratory. Right. I think it's a larger question about the prison and other sites of state captivity, but at the site of the prison laboratory, is there something about the ethical that gets completely, I don't know, imploded or something? You know, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I just actually gave a talk to a bunch of med school students, bioethicists, and judges. And that was a really good Q&A session, because as practitioners, they're very detailed about like what should be done next. And I pretty much told them, like, listen, I'm a humanities person. I can only give you input in very broad gestures. As practitioners, you're the one who's supposed to tell me what's next, right? Now that you know what you know. They know what to do. I don't need to tell them what to do. But one of the things that the bioethics task force did, pretty much, they did not ban prison research wholesale. That's not what they recommended, because ultimately they said that we can turn the prison into a more ethical space for human experimentation. That was their conclusion. And they said if we just reform the prison, you know, if we just had more other like work industries in the prison, so that experimentation wasn't the only work, quote unquote, work that prisoners can do. If we gave prisoners as much money in those other industries as these experiments, then maybe, you know, prisoners won't join the experiments. So they were thinking of all of these reformist ways of keeping experiments, medical science, inside the prisons. And it was the Federal Bureau of Prison that instead said, no, we're just going to ban. We're just going to ban, you know, experiments in all federal prisons, and we're going to stop funding to any other facility that houses prisoners. And so it was kind of like up to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. It was up to cities, states, municipalities to phase out or outright just discontinue their prison programs. Bioethics had really nothing to do with it, after all. But what essentially happened anyway is that medical science experiments left the prison, and therefore the purview of bioethics left the prison. And so to say that ethics is impossible in the prison, I would say that bioethics itself kind of didn't make it possible. like on the ground. Like I don't need to be high theory about that. That is what happened. They made it a space that they couldn't really regulate. And so, you know, it kind of makes me think of the reason why the bioethics task force came to be in the first place is because of the Tuskegee syphilis study. And that, another one, the Tuskegee syphilis study, does anyone here know what the hypothesis of that study was?
We're counting on you to bring that back. Some of us
Okay,
but
this
we
is
want to hear you bring it back.
okay. The hypothesis of that study was that so syphilis is a bacteria, and it preferentially targets the central nervous system, so the spine and the brain. We already knew that at the very beginning of the research, but the hypothesis was that Black people didn't have developed central nervous systems compared to white people, so the bacteria would preferentially target their lungs or their cardiovascular system instead. And so the point of that study was to let these subjects die. That was the point. The point was not to treat them, it was to let them die, so then the bodies could be dissected afterwards to see if the bacteria was in the central nervous system or in the cardiovascular system. That was the hypothesis of that study. And when I learned about that, again, neuroticism, because by then, decades and decades of surgical theaters using Black bodies. Again, you know, all of this data from exploiting Black people in the United States, that was already, you know, wildly available among doctors, health practitioners, that you really can't tell the race of a person underneath the skin. And it was only after 40 years that the Bioethics Task Force was created to address problems just like this one. And then, just like, again, the researchers they were supposed to regulate, they sort of recapitulated the violation and then produced bioethics knowledge out of that.
So in a sense, bioethics is trying to engage in bioethics is its own carceral theory machine, which is in some ways it's like both the opposite and the antagonist of whatever we call critical theory or high theory. So there's that, for whatever that's worth. And then the Federal Bureau of Prisons comes in as the anti-theory machine and just says, fuck all of it. We don't want to deal with any of this.
Yes, yes, exactly. They told the bioethics committee, no, I don't think you're misunderstanding us. The
Right.
point of incarceration is coercion.
Yep. It's kind of the obliteration of theory in a way. So I could spend time on this. Tony, I want to throw it over to you, and also specifically ask you to talk about how you entered the reading, because that's one of the most important parts of how you presented to us in the preliminary discussion.
Okay, thank you. And thanks again, Cristina, for this amazing work. Yeah, so how I entered this was, as I mentioned, I work as a paramedic here in San Diego since the 90s. And since that time, we've done studies or clinical trials, right? Some of these words are coming familiar from your book. And we have a recent one coming up. It's a pain studies through lights, whose network that's linked up with University of Pittsburgh. I know I had that wrong earlier when I mentioned Minnesota. It's University of Pittsburgh. The UCSD is involved, several other colleges or universities. So it's to compare fentanyl and ketamine, and fentanyl being an opioid and ketamine being a non-opioid medication. And it's what they consider a blind study where, number one, you don't have to get consent. At least they're saying there's no consent needed from the patient. and they won't know which medication they're getting because essentially the paramedic wouldn't know. So just let them know that they're getting a pain medication, but not which one. So I started to think about your book, and I had training or an introduction to this study last week, and I was partway through your book, and I had asked, one of the exclusions were prisoners, and I noticed that prisoners was always an exclusion to a lot of the studies that have been brought to San Diego, and I think I've seen probably 4 or 5 or so in my career, since I've been employed with my employer, San Diego Fire, that is. And so I was fascinated with that. So learning through that, but also to your work, my question came to looking at prisons as laboratories. Originally reading Tip of the Spear or Ori Burton's book, and looking at prisons as war. Now I look at them as laboratories as well, but you also kind of draw that connection at the end of your book. But can you speak more to like, is that your ultimate, or how does laboratories and war, I guess, link? I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'm trying to think of a better way to ask that, but.
No, sure thing. I appreciate that question. Thank you. On one hand, because of my training in lab work, I really was thinking about the lab in its most literal sense. I know that laboratory is often used metaphorically. Even Spillers talks about the slave ship as a kind of laboratory. But as a practitioner, and as someone who is in science and technology studies, I really wanted to ground it in the actual practice of science. And so when I call the prison a laboratory, I mean that in the most literal sense, because the kind of experiments that Kligman was doing at Holmesburg were not supposed to be the kinds of experiments you were doing on people. Some of those experiments had no therapeutic applications whatsoever. And that is what defines clinical research. This is what defines the clinic, right? Is that therapy is involved here. But quite a few of the experiments in Kligman's work had nothing to do with treating anything. They were basic research, and basic research is done in laboratories. Basic research is done on animals like mice and rats. And so seeing that was what was happening at Holmesburg, I wanted to, make it clear that this is a laboratory in the most literal sense. And at the end of the book, I didn't so much want to say that the prison as a place of warfare is a lab. It was more an argument about, does everything have to be a lab? Like, let's not have that lab, right? And I say this because, again, I'm in STS. There's kind of a wave where a lot of our research groups are now called like labs, or I'm an editor for Catalyst, a feminist journal in STS, and one of our submissions is a lab meeting, right, where we have discussions. So I'm kind of fighting back against the idea that everything has to be a lab, that every place has to be a source of knowledge production. Because in that chapter where I draw on abolitionist texts, these texts weren't saying we need to speak truth to power, we need more knowledge. They're saying just we need to end the system. And that is not about knowledge. And that's one of the things that I'm at that point in my career where I'm very, I make that as if I'm like I've been in academia so long. No, I'm just a very
Just got started. You can't
disillusioned.
talk like that.
I'm
You
just a
can't talk
very
like that.
disillusioned scholar, wishing that I had stayed in the sciences. But it's more that we know what we need to do, and we keep saying, well, we need more data, we need more information, and I'm so tired of data-driven actions or evidence-based medicine at this point, because I just feel like it drags the process of actually getting certain things done. And so that was the conclusion, and I made it a conclusion because, excuse my French, I was still too chicken shit to really say what I'm saying right now in that book. It's for my next book. But yeah, it's, we don't need to learn more about the prison. We could just end it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for elaborating on that, explaining that.
Cristina, you actually, I think, just echoed the last part of our preliminary conversation, which was drawing the connection between the prison laboratory and this resurgence of especially college and university prison education, so-called prison education programs. So maybe we might be able to come back to that in a minute, but I think that there's some connections. I think they're first cousins, at least, in terms of the connectedness between these sites of knowledge production or knowledge imparting and training, so to speak. But before I launch into that, Alina, let me go to you so you can maybe talk a little bit about the flesh meat discussion that you led us with.
Okay, so as I already mentioned, I'm focusing on what I want to call flesh within the scope of my project, because I feel like the word meat implies very specific kind of idea. It's like only for animals, but then it's also kind of used as a allusion to people in some cases. So I'm thinking of using flesh as my kind of main word, but then reading what your paraphrasing of Spillers, I was kind of challenged with the way that I think about flesh. So I was, as someone who focuses on kind of this conflation of human and animal within like the meat/flesh discourse, I was paying a lot of attention to what you said about like how people in the incarcerated people were thought of kind of as lab animals. But then on page 122, you write that earlier the chapter mentioned that captive test subjects were compared to animal models in experimentation. Yet seeing the carceral system as a space for digestion suggests that there were not even that, or that they were more approximated a different kind of beast. And I didn't quite understand what you meant by that, so I was just wondering, how are they different from like the meat? What makes flesh different from meat? And like, yeah, this all of that.
It always kind of like surprises me just a little bit when someone quotes my work to me, only because I'm like, I wrote that? Oh, that's good. I finished the manuscript doing a COVID-19 2020 stay at home, so I have just no recollection of some of the things that I wrote, sent it to the void, and hopefully it was great. So that's, I'm thinking, I think I wrote that part when I kind of went into a prisoner's discussion about how they were being transferred between facilities, and that they would be put in these really, really, really hot cars where they would stay for hours and they would just suffer. There was no bathroom break, no food, no water, right? And they felt like they were being baked in an oven, pretty much. And I remember that the prisoner ended his description of his experience as we weren't, pigs are better treated than we were, that pigs at least get to be transferred in cars that have cooling systems, and that prisoners themselves weren't even afforded that. And so I ended the chapter with that only because I was also kind of not satisfied with the discussion comparing prisoners to lab animals, because lab animals are specimens or types. So this is usually how we talk about animals in general, that they are types. So for example, when you go to the zoo and you see an elephant, you see an elephant and you think, oh my gosh, that elephant is representative of all elephants, right? That's how we usually see animals. That's why there are zoos. Captivity for wild animals is that they are types. They're supposed to represent the species, right? And so there's a way in which, on one hand, I'm making the argument that Black test subjects were being treated as specimens, modeling the human in constrained ways inside the lab. But farm animals, they kind of exist in this zone where we can type them, but they're not just made to represent all of their kind. We consume them, we eat them, right? The only reason why they exist is to be eaten. And I was trying to kind of connect that to the space or the architecture of the prison itself as a form of a gut. So not only can we think of the prison as a lab that produces knowledge, but it is kind of the gut of the body politic that churns people up, breaks them down. And so that's what I was trying to talk about in that part of the book that you quoted. As when it comes to flesh and meat, I'll talk about that by saying how I used flesh to think about the difference between skin and dermis or epidermis. So again, because of my training, I tend to be obsessed with methods. Science is epistemology all the way down. Any claims or observations we make are only as good as our methods. And so you cannot in the sciences ever disarticulate a claim from how we got to that claim. And so when you read a scientific article, usually in the lab, there's so many, we can't read all of them, all the way through, but we would read the abstract and then we would read the methods section. And so when I was looking at Spiller's work on flesh, I wasn't reading her theory of flesh as ontological. And that may be a misread, and I will own that. However, reading it as epistemological really helped me write my book, which is, so again, flesh as exceeding how the body was theorized by this wave of feminist scholarship interrogating the mind-body binary. And here in my work, I saw a binary between skin and the epidermis or the dermis, because in my work, sometimes I talk about skin literally, so it is the epidermis and the dermis, but other times I talk about it in more abstract ways. And I didn't want to call it metaphorical, and so that's where Spiller's term flesh came in. I was watching closely how she was mapping the difference between the body and this other thing that she ended up naming flesh. And so I kind of borrowed that move that she makes there, and I'm looking at the dermis epidermis, and skin is the word I want to use for this something else that exceeds that. So that's how I would sort of advise you on how you approach meat. There is meat, and then there's this other thing, and what are you going to call that?
That is a perfect that's a perfect transition to the set of questions that came up in conversation with Leslie and a couple others of us. But I'm going to ask Leslie to take the lead on opening this part of the discussion up as far as thinking about skin and skin theory and skin theorization.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Leslie, and I'm a professor of 18th and 19th century Black and African diaspora history. I'm at Rutgers. Thanks for being with us. I learned a lot from your book, so really appreciated engaging with it. The one kind of, and as I said to the group, my disclaimer is that like I am a very like run-of-the-mill like old school historian. So like we have a strange relationship to theory. But so I guess there's two things. One is that I struggled a little bit to understand the concept of like text as skin or skin as text, like that relationship. So like anything you could do to like help talk me through that, I'd be really appreciative. But I think the bigger picture question that I got a little bit stuck on, and I kind of just kept ruminating in the back of my head, is just the question of like whether skin is actually kind of the most, I'm interested in your choice of skin and I totally understand it in terms of the focus on dermatology, right? That's taking place in Holmesburg. But I guess I wonder, like, relative to like race and specifically Blackness, like whether skin is actually the most useful trope in terms of like understanding the sort of fundamental nature of anti-Blackness. I'm sorry, my very overprotective dog, a leaf blew down the street, so it's drama. Sorry about that. But what I was thinking from the perspective of a historian is that like conceptualizations and understandings of like race, especially Blackness, like change and evolve over time, and actually have much less to do, I think, with skin than they do with other things. So like, thinking back to kind of like the colonial era and then how it like evolves over the antebellum period and then into like the 20th century. Initially, phenotype obviously is a big part of it, but it's also connected to like lots of other things besides skin, right? So it's also about like hair texture. It's about the shape of the nose. It's about, as I was saying to the group, I mean, all kinds of things we don't really want to talk about, like genitalia and all these other things, right? So like phenotype does play a big role in terms of like assigning Blackness, but it's not actually the only thing. And in many cases, especially as racial mixture is happening, it's not the most important thing. And of course, that's why we end up like the example I was using in the discussion is like in the case of Cuba, we have 68 different racial categories that all have to do with not just what's the tone of your skin, but like what is your hair shape and what is your nose shape and what are all these other things. And of course, the United States has largely been understood in the early period as being framed like in this black-white binary. But the reality is that we know that that's not actually the case, right? That like there's all kinds of really complex racial categories that dominate the United States like well into the 19th century. And so anyway, I guess I'm just curious about like the choice of skin. And what I was saying to the group is that I think actually over time, blood actually becomes more important even than phenotype, right? Like, especially in the United States, like in other parts of the Americas, all these other things, skin, hair texture, nose shape, all of those things are really important in terms of assigning and understanding race and Blackness. But in the context of what becomes the United States, blood and bloodline, and do you even have one drop, right, of African blood actually kind of becomes the most important thing. So anyway, I guess, and one of the things I'll just say that kind of came out as we were all talking as a group is that a number of us were noticing that like in a lot of the testing, light-skinned Black people were excluded from the tests, right? So then again, I think it raised questions for us about like, is this about Blackness? Or is this actually about something else? Like, is this about So anyway, I'd be interested to like hear you kind of help us understand a little bit like why skin as opposed to like other factors that actually sort of shaped and brought about definitions of Blackness, and the issue of like the role that light-skinned people did or did not play in the actual testing.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So real quick, I will say that for the skin as text argument that I'm making there, I will admit that that was the hardest chapter for me to write, only because I was here using skin metaphorically, which is very difficult for me as a practitioner. And so I started with a clinical observation by Didier and Zhu, where burn victims were one burn victim in particular pretty much yelled at the psychologist in the room to talk to her, so she is not so she can at least kind of be distracted from her pain. And so from there, I thought, like, if I start with something like really concrete, then I can start building the abstractions. I'm just one of those people that just want to start with something concrete first, which I really like about historians, because they go into the archive and start with the very stuff of history, right? So I will say that my thinking of skin, it looks at skin as just one of those things that we use for racial classification, that we have used for racial classification and continue to do so. So this is not meant to kind of remove the focus from other ways that we construct race. And to build on your observation that perhaps blood might be the more significant paradigm or for understanding race, I'm going to go one step further because this is actually something I'm writing about now, and I will say it's genomics, genetic ancestry. And one of the things I've noticed in this current work is how phenotype continues to haunt data, because that is what genomics is. It is turning DNA into data. And one of the ways that we classify all of that data, that DNA that you give up to industrial science, corporate science through a spit in the test tube, it's this, the way we organize it is to first ask the person, how do you identify as? And so this is how we end up mapping DNA. Like when someone receives their results, you not only do you get a breakdown, like by percentage point, we can tell you how much of, for example, Native American you are, right? But they will also show you a map, and they're going to color code the map based on like which areas of the world your ancestors perhaps came from. And so what's interesting to me, there's a contradiction, again, science is so neurotic. There's a contradiction to me in that racial classification, where on one hand, they want to disregard phenotype whatsoever. And they want to disregard any kind of social identity markers and just focus on the DNA. And, you know, it's the DNA that tells you who you are, right? But the DNA won't on its own tell you who you are. And again, this kind of repeats what we saw with the Tuskegee syphilis study. Underneath the skin, you can't tell race, right? But like the Tuskegee syphilis study, which still kind of wanted to hold on to racial categories anyway underneath the skin, the same thing is happening with genotype, which is like, we can't understand all of these billions of base pairs. We're going to ask the person how they identify. We're going to use that to organize this DNA. We're going to classify all of these snippets of DNA into these identities. And the more people give their DNA to us, the more we can get better at this classification scheme. So if you decide to give your DNA to different ancestry tests, you're going to get different results, because it's the algorithm that determines the breakdown of ancestry here. And so even when we get to the level of information, data, base pairs, we have to kind of rehearse our traditional ideas of difference in order to classify people racially. And I will say that there were experiments on white prisoners at this time, and they were generally safer. Those experiments were clinical. But it is something about Black prisoners, the Black incarcerated population, that then all of a sudden we can bring in the lab, the proper lab, into the prisons.
Nassim, let me throw it to you because you had an important kind of elaboration on this point.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Cristina. I had a very great time reading your book. I was, just very briefly, I was part of the Gila theater show from Edinburgh Fringe in 2003, their production team for like part of a domestic touring leg. And like reading this book over a decade later was like such an interesting throw into so much, because Gila as a book is written very differently, but it was like a throwback to a lot of conversation that happened at that point in the production team. But anyway, what I wanted to bring up to this whole point that Leslie has raised, and I talked about this in the group earlier too, was that what I fixated on was this phrase, was the sentence you'd used early on in your book, which said, skin is the visible epistemology of race. And I think I was saying that specifically as an Asian person, I was fixating on that sentence a lot, because one of the things that comes up in Asian conversations over and over is and then Anais mentioned this was also common to like, say, Latin American and other conversations, is how we don't have racism because we don't have races the way North America sees races. And like, you know, stock of the mill answer to that always is how much colorism exists in Asian communities. But I thought that, you know, what you were talking about in terms of the traditional ideas of difference and expounding upon them, in addition to say even something like DNA or like even something that's extremely scientific and clinical, I was thinking about how much the visible epistemology part like applies when you are just encountering a person. And I mean, it kind of threw me into, you know, even the text, like when you like, I know that, you know, there's this thing about the dark skin, lighter skin, and how he was leaning into the dark, like the Kligman experiments were leaning into the dark skinned people. But in chapter 2, where we're talking about seeing pain, he was conflicted, like he was countered by the fact that the visibility of injury was actually harder on the darker pigmentation, and he still wanted to keep choosing to go with it, right? So that was like a spanner in the works of like just being a scientific choice versus it being a choice of the limitless availability and etc. and all those terms that you'd used in terms of like the incarcerated people being like this site of experimentation. But yeah, I mean, it was very interesting to me to think about the visible epistemology of race. And I was to myself thinking about how this could possibly potentially apply to the visible epistemology of caste in like Southeast Asian spaces. But anyway, yeah, that was the basic width of my point. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you for that question. The visual epistemology of race, and and by that I mean, and I don't say ontology. I don't say ontology. I really leaned into the practice, the scientific practice in this book to make that argument about race being, the skin as being a visible epistemology of race. Which is again enfolds Spiller's concept of flesh, flesh as an epistemology to read through bodies. And so that's what I'm saying about skin here, that when we see a person and we start doing all of these sort of like calculations in our head to mark them as racist in some way, it's got nothing to do with them. It's about the lens that we are already looking through. It is our sight. It is our very sight, and that's what I'm referring to there. And so in the chapter on, like in both chapters, whether it was the one on tretinoin or the one on pain, I'm making a very strong argument about race being a tool here. And then it becomes this an object of study. It's not so much an instrument anymore when Kligman suddenly starts feeling bad for his white test subjects because they are in so much pain in his experiments, right? And so he looks at his black test subjects and says, oh, well, I can't really tell if they're in pain or not. They're telling me they're in pain, but I can't really see it on their bodies. And so I'm just gonna keep doing what I'm doing. I'm just gonna keep giving them more concentrated formulas for their treatment, and I'm just gonna soften them for my white test subjects. And so one of the things that I really wanted to make clear in that chapter is that when we want structural change, and here I'm situating it in the method of research, if we want to change scientific method, it is white pain that will catalyze that, not black pain. And again, it is all through seeing, it is all through instruments. And so, yeah, that's what I mean by visible epistemology of race, is that we have to think about it in terms of one relation. Again, it's got nothing to do with the person, it's how we're reading them. And that in my book, I'm situating that relation between not only people, but between people and instruments.
We're running on about 14 minutes left in our session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Magsalan and Kim to come on back to back. Maybe y'all can raise your points back to back, and then I'll go to Susie and Adelie to close us out. That makes sense? Okay, great. Magsalan, why don't you start?
Hi, thanks for writing this book. It seems like it's a very important contribution. And in the course of the discussion today, it occurred to me that that a lot of the discussion seems to reflect what Foucault calls as power knowledge. And you do cite Foucault within skin theory, particularly the notion of capillary knowledge. But power knowledge seems to be like seems to loom large, at least in my reading of it. But I was wondering, perhaps if power knowledge was unimportant in your concept of skin theory, or not as useful in your analysis, because I noticed that it wasn't really. I mean, to me at least, it wasn't. What skin theory describes is an obvious, really obvious example of power knowledge, as in, yeah, this is exactly how power knowledge works. Like, really, the carceral power, creating knowledge out of captive subjects, but it seems absent from your analysis. So I was wondering if it was unimportant somehow, or not as useful as other concepts in your book. So that's what I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Go ahead, Kim.
Hi, Cristina. Thank you so much for writing this book and visiting our class. I found your idea of skin theory really useful. In my work, I talk about the necrosis that happens on unhoused people who use drugs, and how they navigate medical violence. And I haven't been able to write about it because I kind of don't know how without repeating any violence, or not that I don't know how, but I'm just so scared of repeating violence and repeating stigma. So I wanted to ask you about what worked for you in your writing process. What kind of care do you think about for writing about something so intimate like people's skin? And yeah.
Thank you for those questions. I'm going to be really quick so that way our last hands up can also contribute their questions. So for the first one about Foucault's power knowledge, no, it was not as helpful in my thinking. And I'll say that only because, okay, so this is a science and technology book. So of course, Foucault is kind of like you would think would be a shoo-in. But I am very much psychoanalytically informed. And it was so hard to write this book for a science and technology studies field that is not welcome to psychoanalytic approaches. And so I had to bury my psychoanalysis. I had to sort of adopt new language and without like, and using other kind of theorists like Spiller's psychoanalysis, Fanon psychoanalysis. They were pretty much the only, W.J.T. Mitchell, they were the only ones that I could cite that wouldn't like write me out of my field, right? And so Foucault isn't helpful in my thinking simply because he just makes no room for desire in his writings, no room for thinking of the unconscious and lack. And since the arc of my research is about this repetition compulsion in the sciences, Foucault does not help. That's why he was kind of like, I cited him to say, I know Foucault exists. And as for Kim, your question, it reminds me of a student, an undergrad student. I'm teaching a class on visual communication and social change right now, and I'm having them take pictures and things like that. And one of them came up to me and said, this kind of feels extractive or exploitative. And bluntly, I told her, what do you think we do in academia? It is gradations of extraction and exploitation. Academia has been corporatized, continues to be. This is a trend that has been coming up in the last couple decades. Spillers wrote about this as well, right? That you know, academia is about producing knowledge and then hoarding it. So what we as scholars bring to academia are gifts, and academia then turns it into a commodity. And so one of the things that really did affect me writing this book was this, oh, I'm just another researcher going into the prison, creating knowledge from this from this history of violation. Yes, that is what I'm doing. And I think that you have to find your own ways of being accountable to that in your work, because no knowledge project is innocent. I'm not standing on the other side of scientists and saying, you're bad, you're wrong. I'm an expert as much as they are. And I don't know if I'm trying to save bioethics or the sciences from themselves. I think they're very capable of doing that on their own. But I want to help them. And that's my project. Yeah.
Thank you for demystifying the notion of academic innocence. I think we owe you a debt of gratitude for saying that out loud. I appreciate that. Let me shut up. I'm Susie and then Adelie.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for coming and also for sharing your book with us. I wanted to actually ask a question that draws on, oh, hold on a second, that draws on what you were talking about in terms of audience, because I'm really curious, when you were writing the book, who you thought you were writing it for. And it seems like you were writing it for like a biomedical kind of field, and I'm assuming of like academics. And when I was reading it, I was really struck because I'm really horrified because, for example, I have used in the past tretinoin. And for somebody who, who with a skin condition, it's actually like a miracle drug. It's kind of horrible to say, but it really works and functions well for what it was designed to do. And I'm like, this is horrible. This is like the origin of tretinoin and retin-A. You know what I mean? Like, that made me think to myself, like, what do dermatologists think if they know this history? Are you writing in for dermatologists? You know what I mean? Is this like a book that you should be reading in medical school? And if you read it in medical school, like, and then you go I'm actually good friends with my dermatologist, and like I'm gonna give him this book and be like, did you know that this is where tretinoin came from? Like, and then you go and you prescribe it to people. Like, how do you feel about that? You know what I'm saying? So that made me think about who you're writing for. And given the way that you talk about text, and it's very, you do have this analytic background, it tells me that it's not written for doctors. Like my idea is that if you had written it for doctors, it would be written in a different way. And I was just wondering if that was the case, and how you picture your book as kind of intervening in what is it, like a specific academic bioethical field? You know what I'm saying?
Natalie, jump in.
Sorry, I was going to be really quick. Thank you, first of all, for your book. I enjoyed it. I actually teach Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. And so I was just really pleased when I saw how you brought her in. And I remember when she talked about working on that book at Yale, that they did not want her to write that book because they didn't want people to fear, or they didn't want Black people to fear the medical industry. But I say that to say I appreciated learning so much, and I'm probably going to assign it to my students. But I say that, but just me reading it and who looks at the criminal legal system, like I'm reading Blackness, the historical specificity of Blackness and what it means, and particularly in the United States as a criminalized people and people who have not received humanity. And I say that really quickly because now I'm located in New Zealand, and the way that Fanon talks about Blackness to whiteness, so you have this indigenous Maori body, and you notice, and there's a huge migrant population, and this is me as a Black person, they're trying to draw par with indigenous people. And I make these distinctions to say you may be suffering and experience racism, but the way the body is marked is seen as, I see similarities between indigenous people here with Black people, because their mark is being more violent, stronger, and they're targeted and receive harsher penalties, which people are keeping out of discussion of race. And I say that to say that you see this coming up with this reoccurring theme because recently they took pictures, extra legal photographed the police of indigenous youth, and they took their DNA. And so it's so interesting how these little markers that you talk about with skin and experimentation that marks anti-Blackness or anti-indigeneity, or those groups targeted for extermination or something, like I link it to criminalized people. And you just give me a lot to think about in knowledge production, even in when people want to draw par with different racial groups, or it's like, so here when I get it's like, oh, it's just like Black people. I get that a lot. I could meet just my queer, white, middle class academics. They come to me and want to draw par with my experience. And as a Black person, I never say, I know what it feels like to be a Filipino, but I always get every other group saying, oh, it's like being Black. And that's something I have to draw out to my experience. I said, as a Black person, I don't think Black people ever say, I know what it's like to be this. And so I love that specificity that you're mapping criminalized people in the biocapital, that continuation to look at these distinctions between different groups' experiences of racism and dispossession, things like that. So thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions and comments. So Susan, is it? Susan's question. Susie's question. So it's funny, I wrote the book because I had to write it. If I didn't have to write it for tenure, I don't think I would have written a book. I'm gonna be fully honest with you. And even though I didn't write it for practitioners, the practitioners heard about it. And actually I've been asked to talk to a lot of like doctors and bioethicists, and they are generally very gracious. They're just like, yeah, we did that. How do we do better? And so those have been such like welcoming and generative questions. Who did I write it for? I don't know, since I wrote it for tenure. I will just say that since I had to write a book for tenure, I had to write a book that meant something to me, that made the sciences also, like I'm part of this whole field that is making the sciences and medicine more accountable to its histories. And it's really, it feels good to see that they're welcoming of that. Not all, but some. And I will say, you know, this work is not to tell you stop using tretinoin. In the same way that I'm not going to say stop getting your gynecological exams because it was built on the backs of enslaved women. That is not the point of any of this critique that we make in STS. The point is to go back to that, to gynecology and the fraught history of gynecology. It is to say that today, whether we like it or not, we continue to benefit from slavery. So whether we like it or not, we continue to benefit from these experiments at Holmesburg. It's not to stop that benefit, but what are the ethical implications of that? It's a call for accountability. As for Adelie's question, I think and your comment and your observation, I think that speaks to the profundity of Blackness, that other people of color can use Blackness as a way to understand their own experiences. And I will say that for me, I have a bunch of friends who work on Indigenous people in the Philippines, and someone like me would be considered white in their book. So to Leslie's point earlier, right, that race is something different in different contexts, and it's historically informed, right? I focus mainly in the United States. And so seeing all of these other perspectives from elsewhere is, I think, tells us again that race is not this solid thing that stays the same forever and ever. And to just, I guess, bring Fanon back in and his theorization of a new humanism, that's Sylvia Wynter then borrows. The idea is to explode whiteness, which means to also explode Blackness, wherever those categories are used to subjugate people. And if we don't have Blackness then to ground our understandings of the human and material practices around the human, what else can we have? What new world making, what new self makings can we have?
That's
there.
just such a good way to depart from this discussion. Thank you so much. Y'all express your digital love for Professor Cristina Visperas for coming through. Thank you for the energy and the thoughtfulness in everything that you did. And thank you for contributing this project despite the fact you were forced to write it in order to keep your job, which another one of many honest statements that Cristina has offered us today, just fact after fact after fact, just gems. Thank you. Thank you so everybody. Much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming through. Next week, we will be reading Shauna Redmond's excellent book, which I think in many ways, the more I think about it, just another really good transition from this work. But we're reading about Everything Man, about the making of Paul Robeson as a figure. So it's not a biography. You all will see this in the opening pages of the book. It is not a biography, as Shauna frames it. Thank you for the 3 folks who agreed to facilitate. Let me know again if you want to help throw your name in to help co-facilitate that book next week. A quick reminder, the week after, we will be off, and you are invited to the UC People's Tribunal for Palestine, and the following week, we'll be reading Sarah Haley together. Thank you again, all y'all. And Cristina will be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dylan, for inviting me. This has been great. And thank you, everybody.
The recording will be up soon. I'll let everybody know.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, y'all.